The price was suspicious. He should have asked more questions. He had come from far away with his wagon, his belongings, and the certainty that he was starting over from nothing. He opened the door and found 3 orcs staring at him. An older one seated at the table, 2 younger ones standing behind her. The older one spoke before he could open his mouth. "Before you call the guard, hear what I have to say." He didn't know it yet, but his life would never be his alone again. The document was already signed when he heard the first rumor. Dorian had stopped at a roadside post to water his horse when an old man with a weathered hat looked at the deed in his hand and went quiet in a way that said more than words. Dorian asked what was wrong. The man just shook his head and walked away. Dorian figured it was nothing. He had learned in the years since the war that people in border towns liked to make things seem bigger than they were. He climbed back on the wagon and kept moving. He had traveled 11 days to get there, 11 days on a road that turned to dust before noon and mud by nightfall. His horse, a brown mare he called Flint, had not complained once. Dorian envied her for that. He had complained every day in his head, but he kept moving. The farm had cost him 10 years of wages. 10 years of taking work nobody else wanted, sleeping in inns with thin walls, sending money to a lockbox in a town 3 days east. He had seen the notice tacked to a board in a market, land with a structure, a well, an orchard, and a field. The price was so low he read it 3 times. Then he paid a courier to confirm it was real. It was. He did not ask why it was so low. That was his mistake. The road to the property wound through dry hills covered in pale scrub. The sky was wide and flat and the color of old bone. There were no neighbors visible, no smoke, no sound except the creak of the wagon and the wind moving through the brush. Dorian liked it. He had spent too many years surrounded by people who wanted things from him. Orders from above, labor from below. Here there was only the road and the land. He spotted the farmhouse as the sun tilted west. It was old but standing. The roof held. The fence posts leaned but had not fallen. The orchard behind the structure had gone wild, but the trees were alive. He stepped down from the wagon with the deed in his hand. Something moved behind the window. A shadow. Then nothing. He told himself it was an animal, maybe a cat. He walked to the door, knocked twice out of habit. No one answered. So he lifted the latch and pushed it open. 3 orcs looked at him. The one at the table was old, the kind of old that lives in the bones and the eyes, not just the face. She sat with both hands flat on the wood, watching him without alarm. Her skin was the deep green of river moss, her white hair pulled back with a cord of dark leather. Behind her stood 2 younger women. One had her arms crossed and her jaw set in a way that said she'd already decided what she thought of him. The other was still, with eyes that moved across him slowly, like she was reading something. None of them spoke. Dorian stood in the doorway with the deed in his hand, and the last 11 days sitting heavy on his back. He looked at the document. He looked at them. The older one tilted her head just slightly. "Before you call the guard," Madrushi said, her voice low and even, "hear what I have to say." He stood there another moment. The one with the crossed arms did not blink. The quiet one had not looked away from his face since he walked in. The old woman waited. Dorian stepped inside and closed the door behind him. He did not call the guard. He pulled out the chair across from the old woman, sat down, and put the deed face down on the table between them. Then he waited for her to speak. She began the way a person speaks when they have told a story many times and stopped needing it to hurt them. Her name was Grommer. She had lived on that land for 40 years. Her husband had built the fence posts Dorian had seen leaning on the road in. He had dug the well. He had planted every tree in the orchard. They had raised children there, 3 born, 2 survived. The war had come from the east, and the decree had followed it. The land was reclassified. Her husband went to contest it. He did not come back from the town road. The land was reassigned. She and her daughters stayed because there was nowhere to go, and because the land was still hers in every way that mattered to her, even if a document somewhere said otherwise. Dorian listened. He did not interrupt. The younger one with the crossed arms, Vesha, Gromma called her 28 winters, watched him the whole time her mother spoke, watching for something, waiting for him to show her what kind of man he was. The quiet one was Thara, 22 winters, and she had not moved from her spot near the wall, but her eyes had not left him either. "I know what the paper says," Gromma finished. "I'm not asking you to pretend it doesn't exist." "Then what are you asking?" Dorian said. "Nothing yet. I'm telling you first." She looked at him steadily. "So you know who you're dealing with." Dorian sat back. He was 37 years old. He had spent 6 of those years in a war that ended badly, and the years after in the quiet work of not becoming someone he didn't recognize. He was tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. He looked at the 3 of them. At the old woman with her hands flat on the table. At the one who looked like she was daring him to make a wrong move. At the youngest, who was watching him the way you watch a fire to see which direction the wind will take it. He thought about the courier's note, about the price, about the old man who went quiet on the road. The next morning, the door opened without a knock. The councilman who had sold him the land stood in the frame with a smile that had too much relief in it. He was a narrow man with clean boots and dusty instincts. He looked at the 3 orcs still in the house, then at Dorian, and his smile shifted slightly, the way a card player adjusts his expression when the hand goes sideways. "The new owner," he said warmly. "Good. Everything in order." "Fine," Dorian said. "And the—" The councilman gestured loosely toward the 3 women. "I can have the guard here by noon. Straightforward matter. You have the deed and seal, and I can—" "I don't need the guard." The smile stopped. "You're sure? You have every right. I know what I have." Dorian looked at him. "We're done." The councilman stood another moment. Then he nodded once, put his hat back on, and left. Dorian listened to the horse hooves fade. Then he turned back to the table where all 3 orcs were watching him. Gromma's expression had not changed, but something in it had settled. "So," Dorian said, "what do you know how to do?" Nobody trusted anybody. That was fine. Dorian had worked in worse conditions. He started simple. He was up before dawn and worked until the light was gone. He did not ask permission to touch anything, but he also did not touch anything he had not first watched them use. The fence on the south side needed 2 new posts. He fixed them. The cellar door had warped and would not close flush. He shaved it down with a plane and it closed. He did not announce these things or explain them. He just did them. Vesha watched him from corners, not hiding. She did not bother to hide. She stood in doorways and at the edge of the orchard and tracked his movements with the open attention of someone who had learned that the warning signs always came before the trouble, and that if you blinked, you missed them. Dorian was aware of it. He moved in straight lines, same path to the well every morning, same corner of the barn for his tools. He made himself predictable on purpose, not because he feared her, because he had seen the way she held that distrust, close and careful, like something she had paid for with pain. And he understood, without needing her to explain it, that talking would not help. Time would. Maybe. Across the property, Gromma moved through the morning as if the new man in the yard were a weather change, noted, adjusted for, not worried over. She went to the east field and crouched at the soil line, pressing her fingers into the ground and reading something in it that Dorian could not read yet. Thara followed a step behind her, quiet as always, carrying the leather pouch where Gromma kept her small tools, a short blade for cutting samples, a folded cloth, a piece of charcoal for marking. On the 3rd day, Dorian planted seeds in the wrong place. He had chosen a flat stretch of open ground near the south wall. Good light, close to water. He had already turned 4 rows when Grommer walked past behind him. She had spoken plainly to him the evening before, but out here in the field, her language changed. Words were for the table. The land had its own grammar. She raised 2 fingers and pointed to a spot 30 yards further north, near the base of a low ridge, and kept walking without a word. He looked at his 4 rows. He looked at where she had pointed. He pulled the seeds up, moved the tools, and started again where she indicated. By evening, Vesha was watching him from near the barn. He had moved everything without complaining and without asking why. She stayed a few minutes longer than usual before going inside. The next morning, Dorian was on the roof of the cellar outbuilding, replacing a bad patch of thatch, when Vesha came through the yard carrying a bundle of cut wood under each arm. The bundles were too large. He could see it from above. The weight was pulling her off balance with each step across the uneven ground. He climbed down without thinking, the way a soldier falls into a rotation, not because it's asked, but because the gap is there and someone needs to fill it. He grabbed the rear end of the left bundle. She stopped. She looked at his hands on the wood. She did not say thank you. She did not tell him to let go either. They carried the bundles to the wood shelter and stacked them without a word. He went back to the roof. She stood in the yard a moment after he climbed up. He did not look down, but he heard her footsteps pause before she walked away. That night, Thara sat near the small hearth, writing on a piece of rough parchment. Grommer asked her what she was writing. Thara said she was keeping notes. Grommer did not ask what kind. She just nodded and went back to her mending. But she glanced once toward the window, toward the barn where the lamplight was still on, before she bent her head back to her work. It was Thara who found it. She had been clearing the old drainage ditch at the back of the property, a narrow channel that ran along the base of the north ridge, half collapsed and choked with roots and river clay. She had been working quietly for most of the morning when her short blade caught something in the mud that was not mud. She stopped, pressed her fingers into the wet earth around it, pulled it free. It was a small stone, roughly the size of a walnut, but heavier than a stone that size should be. It had a dull surface caked with old mud, but where she had scraped it clean with her thumbnail, the color beneath was unmistakable. She carried it to Grommer without running. She did not run. She walked steadily across the yard holding the fragment in her closed fist, and she set it on the table in front of her mother without a word. Grommer picked it up, held it near the window light, turned it once. Then she set it down on the table and looked at it for a long moment. "Your father used to say there was something in that ridge," she said finally. "He never wanted to break the ground that deep, said it felt wrong." She paused. "I don't think it felt wrong. I think he was afraid of what it would mean if he was right." Dorian was in the barn when Vesha appeared in the doorway. She held up the fragment. He came closer, took it, and felt the weight of it shift in his palm. He had handled enough traded metal in market towns to know what this kind of weight meant. He looked at the ridge through the barn opening. "How much of the ditch is left to clear?" he said. "Half," Vesha said. He handed the fragment back to her. "We should be careful about who sees us dig." She looked at him. "You're not going to go straight to the councilman with this?" "Why would I?" She didn't answer right away. She took the fragment back and closed her fingers around it. "Most men would." "I'm not most men," Dorian said. It wasn't a boast, just a fact, delivered flat. He went back to what he had been doing. Vesha stood in the barn doorway another moment. Then she walked back across the yard toward the ridge. Meanwhile, in the town 3 miles west, a trader who bought and sold rumors alongside his grain was talking to a man who worked near the councilman's office. The trader had seen Dorian's wagon on the road 2 weeks ago and had been curious since. Border farms didn't get new owners without a reason. He asked his questions carefully, the way he always did, wrapped in other questions, padded with gossip about unrelated things. By the time he left the grain post, he had not learned much. But somewhere in the councilman's office, a clerk had noticed that the new owner of the Old Ridge property had been spending time along the north drainage line. The councilman heard this at supper. He chewed slowly and said nothing, but after supper he sat alone with a cup he did not drink from. By morning the fragment would still be a secret. But secrets in small border towns, Dorian knew from experience, had a weight of their own. And weight, given enough time, always finds the ground. The councilman arrived on a Tuesday. He came without the smile this time. He came with the composed expression of a man who has decided to renegotiate, not loud, not angry, just firm in the way that people are firm when they believe they hold the advantage. He tied his horse at the post near the road and walked to the door as if the walk itself were a statement. Dorian met him outside. "I've been thinking about the terms of the sale," the councilman said. "I haven't," Dorian said. "The price we agreed on reflected the condition of the property as stated." The councilman looked past him toward the field, toward the ridge. His eyes stopped there for a moment. "If the condition has changed, if there are assets that were not declared—" "Nothing was declared differently than it was," Dorian said. "I bought the land in the state it was in. What I find on it after is mine. Legally, that's a question worth examining. Then go examine it." The councilman held the composed expression for another few seconds. Then he put his hat back on, nodded once in the way men nod when they want to look unbothered, and walked back to his horse. He did not look at the ridge again, but Dorian knew he had already looked enough. Inside the house, Vesha had been standing near the window. She watched the councilman ride out without moving. Grommer came in from the back room. She did not ask what happened. She looked at Vesha's face and got enough of the answer. "He'll come back with paper," Grommer said. "He'll come back with worse than paper," Vesha said. She was right on both counts. 6 days later, a formal notification arrived, sealed with the council's mark, delivered by a man on a grey horse who did not make eye contact. Dorian read it at the table. Grommer stood behind him, reading over his shoulder in silence. The notice alleged that the sale had been made under incomplete disclosure, specifically that the presence of occupants on the property had not been properly declared during the transaction. On that basis, the council was requesting the contract be reviewed for potential invalidation. If invalidated, the land would revert to council possession pending reassessment. Dorian set the paper down. Grommer said quietly, "He knew we were here when he sold it. He was the one who didn't declare it." "I know," Dorian said. "He's using his own omission against you." "I know that too." Dorian looked at the seal on the paper. "And he's using you as the reason." Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Grommer sat down across from him. She pressed both hands flat on the table, the same posture she had on the first night. "So," she said, "what do we do?" Dorian looked at her. Then he stood up and walked to the window. The ridge was still there. The field was still there. The fence posts he had fixed were still standing. Everything they had built in the past weeks, small and unspectacular, was still standing. "Thara's notes," he said. "Every visit, every man the councilman sent, every date." "She has them," Grommer said. "Good." Dorian turned from the window. "We're going to need them." The next morning, 2 men appeared at the property line. They wore no official markings, but they carried survey tools and the kind of careful manner that comes with being sent rather than arriving on your own. They walked the north edge of the property, measuring, writing in a narrow ledger. One of them knocked a post with his boot as he passed. Not hard enough to call it deliberate, but not accidental either. Dorian walked out to meet them. He said nothing at first, just stood where the property line was. The 2 men looked at him, then at each other. Then Vesha came around the side of the house. She did not come quickly. She walked at her normal pace, long, even strides, arms loose at her sides, her green skin catching the flat morning light. She stopped at Dorian's left shoulder. Not behind him. Not in front of him. Beside him. She did not cross her arms. She just stood there. The two men looked at Dorian, then at Vesha, then at each other again. The one with the ledger closed it slowly. "We'll come back," he said. "Don't come back without notice," Dorian said. They went. Dorian and Vesha stood at the property line and watched the road until the dust settled. Neither of them moved quickly. When the dust was gone, Dorian turned his head slightly and looked at her from the side. She was still looking at the road. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. She turned and walked back to the house. He watched her go. Inside, Thara had been watching through the window. She had her parchment in hand and was already writing the date. Gromma came to stand beside her. She looked through the window at Dorian, who had not moved yet from the property line, still looking at the road, still thinking. "He didn't flinch," Thara said quietly. "No," Gromma said. "He didn't." Over the following days, Thara became the record of all of it. She wrote each event in clean, steady lines, dates, names when she had them, descriptions of what was said and done. Dorian brought her better parchment from his travelling chest. He sharpened her charcoal pencils when they wore thin. He did not ask to read what she wrote. He just made sure she had what she needed. Vesha noticed this. She noticed the way he crossed the room to leave new supplies at Thara's table and then left without commentary. She noticed that he had started learning where each of them preferred to work and moved around it, not avoiding them, just giving space without making it an announcement. She had spent weeks watching him for the moment he would reveal what he actually was. What kind of man who bought land that cheap was actually good? She had been certain the answer was there to find. She was still uncertain, but she had started to consider the possibility that the thing he was hiding might be something as simple and strange as genuine. She didn't say any of this. She went back to work. But that night at the fire, she sat a hand's width closer to him than she had the night before. She didn't look at him. He didn't look at her. The fire did what fires do, and they let it. After the councilman's second visit, Dorian knew the legal path was the only one that would close this cleanly. He had heard mention of a travelling inspector during his first weeks in the region, a man who moved between frontier territories, reviewing contract disputes for the central authority. He asked the same courier who brought the council's notice if she knew how to reach him. She did. Dorian paid her to carry the message. He then spent 2 evenings organizing the packet, the original contract with date and seal, the council's invalidation notice, and Thara's records. 12 pages of close, careful writing that documented every visit, every man sent, every threat delivered, with a polite word wrapped around it. Thara had written the dates in a column on the left side. She had written descriptions that were plain and did not editorialize. She had a way of recording things that made them impossible to argue with. He sent the full packet with the same courier, a woman he had paid fairly once and who remembered that. He paid her double this time and told her it was important. She nodded and did not waste time. 3 days later, the inspector arrived. He was a compact man with a formal coat that had seen too many frontier roads. He tied his horse without help and came to the door with the manner of someone who would rather resolve things cleanly than carry them further. He sat at the table, read the packet, and asked questions in a short, orderly way. Gromma answered him. She did not perform her authority, she simply had it. She told the inspector how long she had lived on the land, how she knew the soil, where the water ran in dry months, which trees were planted by her husband's hands. She named dates without checking notes, because she did not need notes. The inspector wrote steadily and did not interrupt. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said he would review the invalidation request. The councilman arrived within the hour. He had somehow heard or guessed that the inspector was there, and he came in a hurry with a different manner than usual. He spoke quickly. He said that Dorian had been in over his head from the beginning, that the Orcs had taken advantage of an outsider, that the situation was irregular and deserved a second look. The inspector looked at the councilman. Then he looked at Dorian. Dorian said, "I was manipulated into planting in the right spot and not losing my harvest to the first frost. If that's manipulation, you should try it." The inspector looked at the councilman. The councilman opened his mouth, then he closed it. He had come in with an argument and found no place to put it. He left. The inspector signed the maintenance of contract before sundown. The invalidation request was marked archived. He folded his coat over his arm, shook Dorian's hand, nodded to Grommer, and was back on his horse before the light failed. That night, Vesha stood in the doorway of the house and watched Dorian sit on the low step outside. He was not celebrating. He was just sitting. She thought about that. A man who had just won something sitting outside alone in the dark, not looking like he won anything, just looking at the field. She stayed in the doorway a moment. Then she went back inside. After the inspector's ruling, the farm breathed differently. The tension that had lived outside the walls, the watching, the waiting for what the councilman would do next, lifted. Not all at once, but in the way that weight lifts when you put something down you have been carrying long enough to forget it was heavy. Dorian noticed it in the mornings. Less like preparation, more like work. The four of them kept working. Nothing dramatic changed. Grommer still moved through the east field every morning reading the soil. Thara still kept her parchment, though now she wrote observations rather than records of threats. Vesha still worked hard enough to tire a horse and said very little about it. But something shifted in the space between them. One afternoon, a cold front moved down from the northern hills and the temperature dropped fast. Dorian was alone on the north side of the property mending the fence line, a stretch of posts and wire that had been on his list for weeks. He had been working steadily for 2 hours and had not noticed the cold settle in around him until his hands stopped cooperating with the wire. He heard footsteps in the dry grass behind him and turned. Vesha stood a few feet away, holding 2 clay cups. Steam rose from both. She walked to the fence, set 1 cup on the top rail beside him, and turned back toward the house without a word. Dorian looked at the cup. It smelled like bitter bark and something green he didn't know the name of. He picked it up and drank it. It was not good in the way he was used to, but it was warm, and it worked its way into his hands, and after a few minutes he could feel his fingers again. He kept working. The next morning, Vesha found a stack of fresh-cut firewood outside the door she used, not the main door, her door, the one at the back of the house that she had started using without making a point of it. The wood was cut to the right size for her hearth, not his. She stood looking at it for a moment. Then she looked toward the far end of the field, where Dorian was already at work, his back to her. She picked up an armload and went inside. That evening she sat down near the fire a little earlier than usual. Dorian came in and sat in the spot he had gradually claimed across from her, close enough to share the heat, far enough not to crowd. Grommer was at the table mending. Thara was at her small writing corner. No one said anything that needed saying. Vesha looked at the fire. Dorian looked at the fire. The room was warm. After a long quiet, she said, "The south fence line. The middle posts are rotting from the base. You'll need to replace them before the ground freezes." He nodded. "I'll get to it this week." She did not say thank you for the wood. He did not say you're welcome for the wood. But the thing that did not need to be said sat in the room between them and took up space in the most ordinary and solid way. Grommer glanced up from her mending. She looked at the two of them for exactly 1 moment. Then she looked back down at her work and said nothing. Thara, in her corner, wrote 1 line on her parchment and then turned it over so no one could read it. He called the three of them to the table on a Sunday night. He had spent 3 evenings on the document, and not long, not complicated, but careful. 4 names, equal division of whatever the land produced in any season, not wages, not arrangement, a share. He set it on the table without explanation and let them read it. Grommer read it slowly. Thara read it twice. Vesha read it once and then looked at him. He let the silence run. Then he said something he had not planned to say. "I came here looking for a place to stop. I didn't know I was going to find people." He looked at the document, then at them. "But I did, and I can't picture this land without the 3 of you in it." Vesha held his gaze for a long moment. She did not answer right away. Grommer picked up the charcoal pen and signed first. Slow, deliberate, like she was leaving a mark she meant to stay. Thara signed next, small and neat. The candle on the table had burned down low. Vesha was the last. She looked at the paper for another breath. Then she signed. When everyone else had moved toward the door, she stayed. "Why did you stay?" she said. "That first day. Why didn't you just call the guard?" He looked at her. "Because the price was good." She almost smiled. "Liar!" "Liar," he agreed. She left without another word. But she did not go far. He started building the week after. Not a renovation. A new structure, small, set back in the northeast corner of the property, close to the old house but separate from it. He did not explain it to anyone. He just started. Vesha began appearing at the site without announcement. She held the long timbers steady while he fitted the joints. When a wall went up slightly crooked, she noticed before he did, and corrected it before he could make it permanent. She had an eye for structure, not trained, just native. She saw angles the way Grommer read soil and Thara read situations. He did not ask her why she was helping. She did not explain. They worked side by side through the short winter afternoons, the cold coming off the ridge and the sound of hammer and wood carrying across the yard. Grommer watched from outside the old house. One afternoon, Thara came to stand beside her. "He builds close," Grommer said. "I noticed," Thara said. They stood a moment. "Close," Thara said again, quieter. Grommer didn't answer. She just watched. The new house was finished on a night when the moon was full and low, and the whole field ran silver under it. Dorian sat on the front step of the new house. Just sat. The wood was fresh and still smelled like cut timber. The field in front of him was quiet. He could hear the small sounds of the old house, movement inside, a chair, a voice too low to understand. Then the door of the old house opened and Vesha came out. She walked across the narrow yard between the 2 structures without hurrying. She sat down beside him on the step without asking. They were close enough that he could feel the warmth of her arm in the cold air. Across the yard, the door of the old house stood open a moment longer. Then Grommer came out and settled into the old chair on the porch, the one she had always sat in, the one that had been there longer than any of the fence posts. Thara came out behind her and sat on the lower step, pulling her coat close. 2 houses, 4 people, the moon over the field. Nobody spoke. Dorian looked at the land, at the orchard gone wild that they had started to prune back, at the fence line he had mended, at the ridge where the earth gave up something small and golden when you dug deep enough. He thought about the price he had paid. He thought about the old man on the road who had gone quiet and walked away. He understood it now. The man had not gone quiet because the farm was cursed or broken. He had gone quiet because he knew what it was worth, and he knew Dorian didn't. And he was right. Dorian had not known. He had thought he was buying land. He had thought the number on the document was the price. It wasn't. Beside him, Vesha looked out at the same field. Her shoulder was against his. She did not move away, and neither did he. The cold came off the ridge in slow waves, and the fire in the old house threw orange light through the window onto the ground between them. Dorian did not say anything. There was nothing left to say that the evening wasn't already saying better. He had come looking for a place to stop. He had not known, until now, that stopping and arriving were two different things, and that he had only just done the second one. Did you enjoy the story? Subscribe to the channel to watch more stories like this one. Leave a like, it helps the channel a lot. And drop a comment down below. I always read them and use your feedback to make our content better. Thanks so much. Orc-Bound Legacy.